There is a frequency that was buried twice. The first time, in the Egyptian desert, inside clay jars sealed with bitumen, hidden beneath the sand as if the earth itself had been asked to keep a secret too dangerous for the world above. The second time in this is the burial that still holds, inside the mind of every human being born after the Council of Nicaea decided what humanity was permitted to know about the sacred. Two burials, one target, and that target was never a book. It was a sound, a specific vibrational emission tied to a woman whose name the system spent centuries turning into a scandal, a footnote, a repentant sinner weeping at the feet of a man. That woman was Mary Magdalene, and what was erased alongside her name was not theology, it was technology. You have woken up at 3 in the morning with a thought you did not ask for, a voice that does not announce itself, that does not knock, it simply appears, already inside, already cataloging your failures, already constructing disasters that have not happened, already turning the silence of the night into an invisible tribunal where you are always the accused and never the judge. Science calls this anxiety. Psychiatry calls it a disorder, prescribes a molecule and moves on. But the texts that were forbidden from reaching you carry a different diagnosis entirely, and this one does not make you a patient. It makes you a target. The Gnostic tradition understood something about the architecture of human consciousness that institutional religion could not afford to let survive. Consciousness is not a closed system. It is a receiver, and like any receiver, it can be tuned not by your own will, not by your intentions or your prayers or your discipline, but from the outside. The ancient teachers who wrote what would become the suppressed Gospels described layers of reality populated not by angels with golden wings, but by intelligences. Cold, architectural, non-emotional intelligences whose entire function was the management of human energy. They called them archons, not demons in the theatrical sense, not horned creatures from medieval paintings, administrators, parasitic frequencies that do not create, they harvest. The Demiurge, the false creator described in Gnostic cosmology, did not build this world out of love. It built it out of ignorance, a dense material prison that vibrates at a frequency low enough to keep the monad, the divine spark inside each human being, too disoriented to remember its origin. And within that prison, the archons operate like signal interference. They do not need to possess you. They do not need rituals or invitations. They only need access to your frequency. And the most efficient point of access, the door left permanently open by a civilization that forgot it existed, is the unguarded mind at the threshold between sleep and waking. 3 in the morning. The precise moment your rational defenses collapse and something else moves in to fill the silence. This is not metaphor. The texts found at Nag Hammadi in 1945, a collection of leather-bound codices that the Orthodox Church spent 16 centuries trying to make disappear, describe this mechanism with an architectural precision that feels less like ancient spirituality and more like a manual for a machine. The Gospel of Mary, fragments of which survived what can only be described as a systematic campaign of destruction, does not speak about sin. It does not speak about guilt or redemption in the way the approved Gospels do. It speaks about matter. It speaks about the layers through which the soul must pass, and the forces at each layer that attempt to prevent the ascent. It speaks about a woman who understood those forces not as theology but as direct experience, and who transmitted to her circle not a belief system, but a practice. That practice was sonic. It was vibrational. It was not prayer in the sense of petition. It was a mission, the deliberate production of a specific frequency using the human vocal apparatus, designed to create what the text describes as a kind of opacity in the auric field, an invisibility, not to the physical world but to the archonic frequencies scanning for available energy. Mary Magdalene was not the penitent prostitute invented by Pope Gregory I in 591 AD, in a sermon that history has largely forgotten to call what it was, deliberate character assassination. She was the one within the inner circle who held the sonic key. The one to whom, according to the suppressed fragments, Christ transmitted the highest instructions, not because of sentiment, but because she had already developed the vibrational coherence required to receive them without distortion. The Church did not erase her because she was a woman. That explanation is too simple, too comfortable, too easily absorbed into modern narratives about gender politics. The Church erased her because of what she knew, because the frequency she carried and transmitted represented a direct threat to the control architecture. A human being who knows how to make their monad opaque to archonic scanning does not need an institution to mediate their relationship with the divine. They do not need confession. They do not need absolution from a priest. They do not need a hierarchy positioned between their soul and its source. They become, in the most precise sense of the word, ungovernable. And ungovernable souls are the one thing that every system of control, spiritual, political, psychological, cannot tolerate. So the texts were buried. The name was defiled. The frequency was stripped from the liturgy and replaced with ritual that generates the exact emotional states: guilt, unworthiness, fear of divine punishment, that keep the archontic signal strong and the monad weak. You have been living inside that replacement your entire life. The anxiety you carry, the intrusive thoughts that arrive without invitation, the exhaustion that descends without physical cause, these are not evidence of your brokenness. They are evidence that the signal is working exactly as designed. But there is a crack in the system. There always was, and it has been waiting, encoded in fragments that survived 2,000 years of suppression, for the precise moment when enough people were awake enough to receive it. What that crack sounds like, and what happens the moment you produce it, is what has been hidden most carefully of all. The fragment survived because it was considered too damaged to be dangerous. That is the irony that history never corrected. When the Nag Hammadi codices were discovered by a peasant digging for fertilizer near a limestone cliff in Upper Egypt, the Gospel of Mary was already incomplete. The first 6 pages gone, another 4 ripped from the middle, as if someone, at some point, had decided that even a partially destroyed text needed to be made more incomplete. What remained was enough to reconstruct the architecture of a teaching. But the sonic element, the specific instruction about vibrational emission, survived only in cross-referencing the Magdalene fragments with a secondary Coptic text that mainstream scholarship dismissed as corrupted and set aside. Set aside, the academic equivalent of a second burial. What that cross-reference reveals is not a prayer, not a mantra in the Eastern sense, not a chant borrowed from any tradition you have encountered in the sanitized version of spirituality sold in modern wellness culture. What it reveals is a structured exhalation pattern built around a single Aramaic root, the root from which, in the original spoken language of the inner circle, the concept of the soul's return was derived, not the return as in reincarnation. The return as in signal recalibration. The moment when the monad stops broadcasting on the Demiurge's frequency and reestablishes its original transmission. The Aramaic root is nafsha. It does not translate cleanly into any modern language because it was never meant to be read. It was meant to be produced physically, with the throat, the chest cavity, the sternum acting as a resonance chamber in a specific elongated pattern that the fragment describes as the sound the soul makes when it remembers it is not from here. Stop for a moment. Feel the weight of that phrase, not a metaphor handed down through centuries of comfortable interpretation, a technical description, the soul making a sound, the soul remembering, the act of remembering being sonic, not cognitive. This is the inversion that the suppressed tradition operated on, the understanding that the archontic control system functions primarily through the cognitive layer, through thought, through the internal narrative that the rational mind generates constantly, the voice that never stops, the tribunal that sits in judgment at 3 in the morning. The cognitive layer is the compromised layer. It is the layer that has been tuned, conditioned, colonized by centuries of fear-based religious programming, and the low-frequency emotional environment that programming deliberately maintains. You cannot think your way out of an archonic frequency. That is the trap that most spiritual seekers fall into without ever recognizing it as a trap. The meditation techniques that ask you to observe your thoughts, the affirmation systems that ask you to replace negative thoughts with positive ones, the therapeutic models that ask you to examine the origin of your patterns, all of these operate within the cognitive layer. They are, at best, rearranging furniture inside a room that is already compromised. At worst, they are keeping you occupied inside the system while the system continues to run. Mary Magdalene's teaching does not address the thought. It bypasses it entirely. It goes directly to the vibrational substrate beneath cognition, the level at which the monad actually operates, and produces a frequency there that the archonic signal cannot overlay. This is why the intrusive thoughts stop, not because you have processed them, not because you have achieved some psychological insight about their origin. They stop because the signal that was generating them has lost its receiver. The archons do not pursue a monad that has gone opaque. They are not beings of persistence or attachment. They are beings of efficiency. They move to the next available frequency. And you are left, sometimes for the first time in years, inside a silence that does not feel empty. It feels ancient, like something that was always there, underneath all the noise, waiting with a patience that has no human equivalent. The elongated naphtha emission works in 3 stages, and the fragment describes each one with a specificity that leaves no room for mystical vagueness. The first stage is the physical grounding, the production of the sound from the lower chest, not the throat, activating the body's own resonant architecture before any intention is introduced. The chest cavity becomes a bell. The sternum becomes the clapper. The sound produced at this stage is subvocal in the sense that it is felt more than heard, a vibration that moves through bone and tissue and establishes, at the cellular level, a coherence that the body does not normally maintain under conditions of archonic exposure. You feel it as warmth, sometimes as pressure behind the sternum, sometimes as a sudden involuntary deepening of the breath, as if the body itself recognized the signal and responded before the mind had the chance to interfere. The second stage is the elongation, the extension of the central vowel sound within naphtha into a sustained tone that the fragment associates specifically with the heart center, not as a metaphor for emotion, but as a literal anatomical location whose electromagnetic field, when entrained to the correct frequency, extends beyond the physical body and creates what the Coptic text describes as a membrane, not visible, not physical, but real in the only sense that matters in the Gnostic framework, real at the level of energy, at the level of the field where the archonic frequencies actually operate. That membrane is the shield. That membrane is what the entire tradition was built around: protecting, transmitting, and ultimately dying, to keep hidden from the institutions that understood exactly what a shielded monad meant for their continued authority. The third stage is the silence after the sound, and this is the element that every modern approximation of this practice gets wrong, because the silence is not a pause. It is not the absence of sound. It is an active state, a receptive frequency that the monad enters after the shield has been established, in which the original signal, the one that predates all archonic interference, can begin to come through. This is what Mary transmitted to the inner circle in the moments that were too dangerous to write down in any text that might survive institutional scrutiny. Not the sound itself. The sound was the preparation. What she transmitted was the knowledge of what to do in the silence that followed. And that knowledge, what arrives in that silence, what it shows the soul about the nature of its imprisonment and the precise architecture of the way out, is the piece that has never been fully written, because it cannot be written. It can only be experienced, and you are closer to that experience right now than the system that buried it ever wanted you to be. There is a moment that every person who has ever genuinely touched their own monad describes the same way, regardless of culture, regardless of century, regardless of the language they use to try and contain what is ultimately a prelinguistic experience. They describe it as recognition, Not discovery, recognition. The feeling that what they are encountering was not found but remembered. That it was always there, structural, permanent, unaffected by everything the material world had layered on top of it. The Archons cannot create that feeling. The Demiurge cannot simulate it. No frequency of fear, no architecture of guilt, no centuries of institutional programming can produce a convincing counterfeit of the moment the monad recognizes itself. And that is precisely why the system spent 2,000 years making sure you never got close enough to feel it. The silence after the nafshu emission is that proximity. It is not enlightenment. It is not transcendence in the theatrical sense. It is something more precise and more radical than either. It is a momentary cessation of the archontic overlay, a gap in the signal. And in that gap, the monad does not think. It does not analyze or interpret or construct narrative. It simply is. And the quality of that being, the texture of it, the temperature of it, the way it feels against the inside of your own awareness is so fundamentally different from everything the compromised cognitive layer produces that there is no risk of confusion. You will know, not because someone told you what to look for, because the soul recognizes its own nature the way the eye recognizes light, instantly, without instruction, without effort. What Mary Magdalene understood, and what made her presence in the inner circle not a matter of proximity or sentiment, but of absolute necessity, was that this recognition, this gap in the archontic signal, could be stabilized. It did not have to be a flash. It did not have to be a peak experience that faded back into the noise of ordinary compromised consciousness within minutes or hours, leaving only a memory that the rational mind would immediately begin to doubt and diminish. The sonic practice was not designed for single use. It was designed for repetition, for the gradual, cumulative thickening of the auric membrane until the archontic frequencies were not merely interrupted but structurally excluded, until the default state of the monad was not bombardment but coherence, until the 3 a.m. tribunal became, simply, silence, not the silence of suppression, the silence of sovereignty. This is the inheritance that was stolen. Not a belief, not a theology, a practice with measurable effects on the lived experience of every human being who carries a monad, which is every human being without exception, including the ones who have been most effectively convinced that they are nothing more than the sum of their neurochemistry and their trauma history. The theft was not abstract. It was not philosophical. It was conducted against your specific life, your specific nervous system, your specific experience of waking up in the dark with a mind that feels like it belongs to something other than you, because it does. That is the diagnosis the suppressed texts carry, not to frighten you, to liberate you. A target that knows it is a target has already begun to step outside the range. Feel what is happening in your body as you hold this. Not the idea of it, the actual physical response to a truth that some part of you already knew before you had the language for it. The tightness in the chest that arrives not from fear, but from something releasing that has been held for a very long time. The breath that drops lower than usual. The sudden, inexplicable sense that the room you are sitting in is slightly different than it was 10 minutes ago. Not visually, not physically, but in some dimension that you do not have a trained vocabulary for yet, though you are developing one right now, in real time, as the archontic frequency loses its grip on the receiver it assumed was permanently tuned to its channel. Mary Magdalene was not erased because the church feared women. She was erased because she was the carrier of the one practice that made the entire control architecture obsolete. A human being with a stabilized monad, shielded by the membrane that the nafsha emission builds over time, does not need mediation, does not need an institution positioned between their soul and the pleroma, the fullness, the realm of pure light that the Gnostics identified as the monad's actual origin and actual home. Does not need to be told they are broken in order to be sold the specific form of repair that keeps them perpetually dependent and perpetually generating the low-frequency emotional field that the archons require to operate. Guilt, unworthiness, the chronic low-grade terror of a God who is watching and measuring and finding you insufficient. These are not spiritual experiences. They are a food source, and you have been feeding something that never introduced itself. The practice does not ask for your belief. It does not require that you accept any cosmology, any mythology, any framework that does not resonate with your own direct experience. It only asks for your throat, your chest, your breath, and the willingness to sit in the silence that follows and allow whatever arrives there to be received without the cognitive layer immediately moving in to classify, diminish, and file it away under the category of things that were probably not real. That category is the last defense the Archonic system has once the sonic shield begins to form. The voice that says this is imagination. The voice that says you are not the kind of person this happens to. That voice is not yours. It has never been yours. And the moment you produce the first elongated descent of nausea from the lower chest, the moment the sternum begins to vibrate with a frequency older than any institution that ever tried to own the sacred, that voice will have a little less authority than it did before. And the next time, a little less than that. Until one morning you wake up at 3 and there is nothing there but you, just you, the monad, quiet, coherent, sovereign, and absolutely unreachable by anything that was never meant to touch you in the first place. That is not the end of the path.